So we're now on the bottom of Chavav Amid Aleph, about to turn to Chavav Amid Beis, and we're up to Ketzad. And at this point, Reb Shimon ben Menasya is going to break down the shita of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, into three different dinim, three different scenarios. 2 lines before the end of Chav Ches Amid Aleph. Number 1, Nolad bo mum erev yontif. If the animal had a mum, this bechar had a mum on erev yontif, then ein mevakrin oso b'yontif. In other words, we should avoid inviting the mumche to make a determination on yontif as to whether or not it's a bal mum, even though the mum already existed on erev yontif. But nevertheless, Reb Shimon ben Menasya, in interpreting Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, hold that ein roem mumim b'yontif. Now, the law of ein mevakrin oso, as the Rishonim interpret it, means that l'chatchila we should not allow and invite the mumcha to make that determination. The Rabbanan prohibited it as a shmutz. However, b'di'evet, if the mumcha made a determination on yontif and established that this animal is in fact a bechar bal mum, then we're going to allow him to shech the animal on yontif. Why? Because it was already a bal mum on erev yontif, and therefore what it's missing is just the re'iyah of the chacham. Otherwise, all the pieces of the puzzle are fit into place, and it's mutar b'shchita. We just need that very last makav patish, so to speak, that the chacham should see and determine that it's a bal mum. So b'di'evet, he shouldn't have done so, but we're not going to impose any penalties. Case number 2, noled bo mum. Here we turn to Chavav Amid Beis b'yontif. Now it became a bal mum on yontif. Erev yontif, it was a perfectly healthy animal, this bachar. It was a tam. And now, again illegally, the chacham, the mumcha, made a determination that on yontif it became a bal mum. Going into yontif, it was not a bal mum. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ein zeh min hamuchan. He's not allowed to shech this animal, even though normally b'di'evet, if the mumcha made that determination, we would allow shechita, but not in this case, because since this animal going into yontif on erev yontif was not royal shechita, was not permissible to shechita, and the reason for that is because it was a tam, a bechar tam, it was perfectly healthy. Therefore, when the chacham determines, and he shouldn't have done so, that this animal became a bal mum and yontif, then it's a brand new ball game, and it's muktzah because going into yontif, the animal was not suitable for shechita, for eating. And not only that, the chacham, to boot, is being masakin in the animal, because again, right now the animal has a cheskes tam, it was perfectly healthy. So the re'iyah and the determination of the mumche is a transformation of the status of the animal from isur to heter by establishing that it's a bal mum kavua. That transformation is like a tikkun, a change in the animal, which we're not allowed to do on yontif. And therefore, even with the eved, although the animal became a bal mum and the mumcha determined and established it as a bal mum, nevertheless, we're not allowed to shech the animal. And these are the 2 points of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that are under contention, because Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said, no, you're allowed to make this determination on the part of a mumcha on yontif. Again, in this case where it was a bal mum going into yontif, then we wouldn't really invite a mumcha l'chatchila, but b'di'evet certainly it would be allowed. However, if it's shav, and now we get to the 3rd level, in which there's a unanimous opinion of both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Shem nolad hu umumo imo shezemin amuch. If at the very moment of the birth of this Bechar, it was at that moment a balmum, meaning that the animal already had. Again, I apologize if I use the wrong word here, but I'm going to use the word that a deformity, it had a physical deformity in virtue, in its embryonic stage before it was born. So already at the moment that it was born as a balmum. And therefore was never, ever in the status of a tam. From the moment of its inception, its entry into this world, it was already muta b'shchita. It was a bechar balmum which you're allowed to shech. And in that case, it never had a status of isur, and therefore it's not called mitaken. If the Kohen, I'm sorry, keeps making that mistake. If the mumche, he doesn't have to be a Kohen. If the expert determines and pronounces this animal to be a balmum, as a bechar, it's muta b'shchita, then even Reb Shimon would agree that you're allowed to shechten on Yontif. Why? Because Reb Shimon's problem is with an animal that went through stage one, it was a tam, it was also b'shchita, and now it became a balmum. But in this case, the animal was never also b'shchita. There was no cheskes isur from the onset, from the get-go, and therefore Reb Shimon would say that this is not included in the shvus d'Rabbanan of the mumche changing the status like a din and issuing a verdict. This is not a verdict. All that we need the mumche to determine is that this animal, from its inception, from its birth, was a balmum. But now the Gemara wants to know, in this case of an animal, a bechar, that was born a balmum, does Reb Shimon ben Menashe mean to tell me that even lechatchila we can invite the mumche to make that determination? Dorash Rabba Bar Huna, again, he's going to come under contention, but nolad hu mumo imo mivakrin also b'yontiv lechatchila. We have no compunctions about inviting the mumche to come and make that determination. Amalei Rav Nachman, Avatani, my father had a Beitza, and the Beitza says, Im avar ubikro mivukar, that in the case of Bechar that was born with its mum, if the Chacham went ahead and he was mavakir means to investigate, and he determined that indeed the animal is a balmum, then b'di'evid you're allowed to shecht it. But l'chatchila, to invite a mumche, a chacham, to make that determination on Yontif, for sure we're not going to allow it. You are taking a position that is contrary to a Beitza. Omar Abaye, nevertheless, Abaye says, Kavase de Rabba bar Rav Huna mistabra. I would nevertheless defend the position and the view of Rabba bar Rav Huna that nolad hu umumo imo is mutar lechatchila. You're allowed to invite the mumche to make that determination on Yom Tov from a different price. With all the respect of Nachman and his Beitza, but what about a different Beitza? We quoted back here on Chavav and Aleph a different Beitza, and in that Beitza, Reb Shimon ben Menashe outlined 3 different cases and 3 different dinim. And according to Rav Nachman and his Beitza, what should have happened was that Rav Shimon ben Menashe should have reduced those 3 cases to 2 cases, meaning he should have integrated 2 cases that have the same din under one roof. in one paragraph. Nolad bo mum erev yontif ein mevakrino so biyontif, which means l'chatchila hu delo hadi evet shapir dami. If there was a mum on erev yontif, then it seems from Reb Shimon ben Asi's presentation that b'di'eved, if the mumche determined illegally that this bachar is a bal mum kavua, then we can check. Then, in the second paragraph, the second div, Reb Shimon ben Asi says that nolad bo mum b'yontif. If, on the other hand, there was no mum on erev yontif, the animal was a tam, a complete animal, healthy, without any blemishes, going into yontif, then Reb Shimon Omer, ein zeh min hamuchan. What does ein zeh min hamuchan mean? This has no hachana, because again, entering into yontif, the animal was a tam. Yafilu b'di'eved, even if the mumcha went ahead and he determined, which he shouldn't have done, on yontif, that this animal became a balmum on yontif, namilo, we're not going to allow shchita. So we have one case, the first case, where lechatchila, we're not going to allow the determination of the mumcha, but b'di'eved it's reliable. And in another case, even b'di'eved, we're not going to allow shchita. For hadatani, now we get to the third paragraph, where there's a unanimous decision. Vishav and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon both agree. If nolad mumo imo shezeh min hamuchan. What does that mean? Are you telling me it's only b'di'eved? It's got to be afilu chatchila. Why? Because if it was b'di'eved, then this third case should have been integrated with the first case of an animal that had a mum on erev yontif going into yontif, and illegally the mumcha went ahead and determined that it is in fact a bal mum. And we said that even though lechatchila we're not allowed to invite the mumcha to make that determination on yontif, that's a shvus d'Rabbanan, but nevertheless b'di'eved we can rely on. If this case of nolad hu umumo imo is also only a b'di'eved, then it should have been integrated into the first case. And the fact that it was separated by Reb Shimon ben Menashe into a third clause indicates that it has its own unique div. And that means even lechatchila, we're allowed to invite the mumcha on yontif, no compunctions, no inhibitions, to make a determination about this bachar, that at the moment of its birth, it was coming into this world a balmum. So this Beitza supports, says Abaye, the position of Rabbi Bar Huna, that nolad hu mumo imo is mutar lechatchila. We're allowed to invite the mumcha to make that determination. So Gemara asks the following question: V'haki asa Rav Oshaya. Rav Oshaya was one of the Amorim from Narda, that city of Bavel. And when he came, asa v'yaisa masnisa biyadeh. He had another Beitza which he brought and he transmitted. And here's the language of the Beitza: Bein shenolad bo mum me'erev yontif, bein shenolad bo mum b'yontif. Whether the animal became a balmum before yontif or on yontif itself. Chachamim, now it's very interesting, we'll pick this up later in the sugya. The word Chachamim is a reference to Rabbi Shimon. Very strange that this Beitza, instead of quoting Rabbi Shimon, uses the term Chachamim, but hold on to that for later on. Anyway, Rabbi Shimon holds that we're not allowed to invite the mumcha to see mumim on yontif. Ein zeh min hamuchan. Now look at this. The Beitza actually integrates two dinim together, which means that even b'di'eved, if the mumcha made a determination that the animal is a bechar, balmum, and he had no right to do so, then we're not going to allow shchita. And therefore, in the case of nolad hu mumo imo, shezeh min hamuchan, and everybody agrees that you can shech the animal, that's only b'di'eved. because the other two cases are also b'shchita, even b'di'evet, if the mumche illegally went ahead and made the determination and pronounced the mum kavua. Well, l'chatchila, we would not allow the mumche to see this mum and check it out. So this is difficult on Abaye because Abaye brought a proof from a different brisa that nolad hu mumo imo is mevakrin also lechatchila. Even lechatchila, we're allowed to set up a re'iyah of a mum. So the Gemara says elo de kashaha. Now, although it's true that Rav Ochia came for an adoy with a brisa, but what's he going to do with the first brisa, where Abai was medayik from the brisa, that in the case of hu nolad hu mumo imo, even lechatchila you're allowed to be mavaker. Hahi, that first brisa should be attributed to Ada. Ada was a great scholar, Bar Uchme. He came from, or his father's name was Uchme, and he, meaning he's the author of that price. Now, although as I mentioned to you, Ada was a scholar, but at that time in history, there were complicated situations in verifying the authenticity of a brisa. Are you aware of this? Not every brisa is reliable. And there were different Amoraim who brought to our attention and transmitted their particular brisos from their locale. And as it turns out, this Chacham by the name of Ada, and my heart goes out for him, he got stuck with a lot of brisos that were unreliable, which in the Gemara's language is called Dimishabech Vitani. Shibush means mistakes. And I will share with you that I myself have an interest in antique Sfarim. Again, if I ever have a chance, I'll give you a tour of some of the unbelievable books that are right behind my back over here. First editions from hundreds of years ago. And I can tell you that with what's called Kisvei Yad manuscripts and so forth, there are a lot of shibushim, a lot of mistakes. And multiply that back at the time of the Brisa, because again, Rabbi Yudah Nasi, when he organized the Mishnah and he edited it, he chose which Brisos were absolutely reliable, and a bunch of the Brisos that were floating around were unreliable. And this fellow by the name of Ada, unfortunately, he got stuck with a lot of those manuscripts that were full of shibushim. Shibushim means mistakes. And therefore, we don't rely in a halachic discussion on a brisa that was taught to us by Ada Bar Uchmi. But rather, we should assume that the main and reliable brisa is that brisa that was brought by Rav Ochia, because Rav Ochia always had the correct and authentic manuscripts of the brisas. We're talking about a case where the animal, this bachar, fell or injured itself in one way or the other on Erev Yontif, and it had a move on Erev Yontif, and we're going to be medayek from our Mishnah a diuk that would support Rav Oshia. Dikatani, it says in our Mishnah, Rav Shimon Omer, Kol she'ein mumo nikar me'erev yontif, ein zeh min ha'muchan. If we could not determine with any obvious investigation that the animal had a mum kavua on Erev Yontif, ein zeved a muchan. What does that mean? Ein min a muchan. Ilem she'ein mumo nikar klal. If you're going to talk about a case where there was no even indication whatsoever that the animal on Erev Yontif had a mum, is pshita. Tzricha l'meimar, question mark, a rhetorical question. Did Reb Shimon have to tell me that according to Rabbi Yehuda, who is the Bar Plukta, did he have to tell me this din ein min hamuchan? If the mum was generated on Yontif itself, then even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that roim mumin b'Yontif, this would be also because it's muktzah. Ella, it must be a case where there was a mum on Erev Yontif, but the lo is chazi l'chacham. It was not shown and determined to be a mum by a chacham on Erev Yontif. Im mum kavua, im mum over. Tani muyas, ein ze min hamuchan. That means we cannot allow you to shecht it because Reb Shimon holds, in this case, even though the mum was on Erev Yontif, but nevertheless, it was lacking the re'iyah of a chacham, and the re'iyah of chacham is prohibited on Yontif, and therefore it's muktzah. Ishma mina, we see clearly from our Mishnah that even if there was a mum on Erev Yontif, nevertheless, according to Reb Shimon, even b'di'eved, when the chacham saw it and determined that it's a bal mum, they're not permitted to shecht it, because in the absence of the re'iyas chacham on Erev Yontif, going into Yontif, the status of the animal is that of muktzah, and that's what he means, Eino min hamuchan. Then in the case of Nolad umumo imo, and then Reb Shimon says, Shezeh min hamuchan, what he meant is that b'di'eved, you can rely on the illegitimate re'iyah of the mumcha, and that's b'di'eved like Rav Nachman. Boy minei Hillel, this is not Hillel Azakin, this is Hillel, a contemporary of Rava. Yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos, o ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. What does this mean? You had something that was perfectly edible going into Shabbos, but during Shabbos it became unedible. And then once again, during that same Shabbos, it became edible. So do we say that at that moment that it became unedible, it became muktzah with all the dinim? Once something is muktzah, it's already muktzah for the entire Shabbos. Or do we say, no, it's not really muktzah, it's a temporary situation, and as soon as the food becomes edible again, then it's no longer muktzah. Echi dami, what's the case? Idi chaze ben hashmoshos. If, let's say, they used to take grapes and climb up to the roof like a sun deck, and the beating of the heat of the sun would make it into raisins. But before it became raisins, it got very spoiled in its first state. If, in this case, it already became edible going into Shabbos, then he chaz it. There's no din of muktzah. It was a foodstuff going into Shabbos. The lois chaz it, and if on the other hand it was, sour and unedible going into Shabbos, then lo chaz it. Then it's muktzah. So what's your question? Lo tzricha, the Gemara answers, my question is the chazeh, although it was edible during Ben Hashmoshos, it was completely dried, and they were dried raisins or figs or whatever it might be. But hadar idche, in the middle of Shabbos, let's say 9 a.m. on Shabbos morning, the rains fell down from the heavens, and the dried fruits absorbed the water of the rains, and they became what's called tafchu. Tafchu means like bloated. It's not edible anymore. So at that moment, it became muktzah. But hadar ichze. Then the sun came out, and once again removed all that excess moisture and dried the fruits in such a way that now they're edible. My, what's the status? Do we say that as a result of that hour, in quotation marks, that it was inedible, it's muktzah for the entire Shabbos? Or do we say no, it was only muktzah for that period of time, and now that the sun has dried up the fruits again and now it's edible, now it's no longer muktzah? Amalei Rava responded, yesh muktzah. And that means that once it was nidche, it was muktzah, it was excluded during that period of time when it was unedible, then it becomes muktzah and continues to be muktzah for the entire balance of Shabbos. Esvei, so Hillel responds by raising the following objection from a brisa. Vishavin, this is the brisa of Rab Shimon ben Asi that we studied earlier, that in the third case of Imnolad Umumo Imo, everybody agrees, both Rab Yehuda and Rab Shimon, who had a machlokus whether you're allowed to invite a mumche to see a bechar on Yom to determine whether it's a Baal Mum or not. Shezeh min hamuchan. This is min hamuchan, and you're allowed to eat it. So what's the kasha on Rava? Ve'amai, if you're holding that yesh muktzah lechatzi Shabbos, how could that bechar be mutar b'achila? Nema, why don't we say that high bechar meikara at the moment of ben hashmashos, meaning when Yontif entered, and this animal was in an embryonic state, havichazi gave ime, had you shechted the mother, you would be allowed to eat the fetus. And that's called Shchitas Ha'em Mahani Labas, otherwise known as a Ben Kua, if you've ever heard that phrase. For that, we'd have to learn Masechet Chulin. But let's just accept this principle as axiomatic, that if you shecht an animal and you find an embryo inside the animal, then you're allowed to eat the embryo if it matures and it's not a treifa and so forth and so on, and it doesn't need shchita. Now, afterwards, this yalidle, once it's born into the world, it is now endowed with the kedusha, the sanctity of a bechar, and therefore itchile. Now we assume that this bechar is a tam. We have no reason to assume otherwise. There's no blemish, no obvious blemish, and therefore you're not allowed to shecht it. So at that moment, it became itche. Itche means it became muktzah. Now, the Chacham makes a determination that this is a Baal Mum Kavua, Ishtarele. And now you're allowed to eat it. Now, according to Rava, since at one point before the Mumche saw the animal and determined that it's a Baal Mum, it was Aser B'Shchita, Aser B'Achila. So it was already nidche, it already had the status of muktzah. And Rava maintains the yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. So how could it be that the brisa of Rav Shimon says that in nolad umumo imo zemin amuchan? How could you allow eating it if yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos? And even after the determination of the mumche that it's a bechar bal mum, nevertheless you couldn't eat it because it remains muktzah. Rabbi V'Temer of Safra Kigon the Yasvei Dayone Hasa. A wild case. At the moment that the Bechar was born, at that moment, the Dayanim were present, and immediately with its birth, they saw that it has a mum kavua, and therefore it never had the status of muktzah. It was not a second in time when it was excluded. The Gemara offers another alternative defense of Rava. Rava would say to Hillel, Ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. A whole new lishna and a whole new transmission of Rava, that Rava says, Ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. Now the brisa of Rav Shimon ben Asi becomes a proof text to Rava. Lema Messiah, it should be a proof text. It says, "V'shavin both Rav Yehuda and Rav Shimon shem nola umumo imo shezemin amuchan v'abachar meikara havi chazi agav ime." And isyalidle, once it's born, idchile, it has the sanctity of Bukhar, and it's nidche until the mumche sees it, and then achse lechacham ishteri le. And we're saying that it's not muktzah, it's mutabachila. You see a proof to Rava that ain't muktzah lechatzi Shabbos. Abaye v'temer of Safra. There's no proof in this brisa because the brisa is talking about a very specific scenario. Kigon the Yasve Dayone Hasam. The Dayonim were there at the time of his birth, and immediately they saw the mum, and it was never mus. Toshma. Now I'm going to prove to you that Yesh Muktzah Lechatzi Shabbos to support Rava. Hoya Ochel Banovim. Before Shabbos entered, he was eating grapes. Vahosir, and there was some leftover grapes. Vehelen Lagat, and he brought them up to the roof, the sunroof, the sun deck. And Lasos Mem Tzimuk, if he wants to make raisins, V'te'enim, or there were extra Hosir figs. Vehelen Lagat, Lasos Mem Grogos, he wants to make dried figs. Lo Yochel Mehem Anshi Yasmin Mivodyo. He shouldn't eat them on Shabbos unless he designates them before Shabbos that he will eat them on Shabbos. The Farsikin, Bechavushim, Besharim Kol Minei Peros, a whole list of quinces and peaches and so forth, that he brought it up to the God. What's the case? If they were already dried before Shabbos, why does he have to go ahead and make a pronouncement that I will eat from these dried fruits? They're perfectly dry, perfectly edible. If they're not edible because the process of drying is not completed, then what good would it do when he points to something that's not edible and he says, well, I'm going to eat it? It's like Eitz and Vavonim. A person can't say, well, these Eitz and Vavonim are mizumanim, they're muktzah. Hazmana is not going to help. And if you'll tell me, he really didn't know whether or not entering into Shabbos it had completely dried and it was royal achila, or it hadn't dried and it's not royal achila. And in such a case, the Brisa tells me that if he makes hazmana and he says, well, if they'll be edible, I'm going to eat from them tomorrow on Shabbos, and that hazmana is meaningful. If he didn't make hazmana, since he didn't know whether it would be suitable for eating on Shabbos, it's muktzah. Rav Kahana said muktzah sheyovash. If you have these raisins or figs that became dry on Erev Shabbos, but the Bailam are not aware of the fact that before Shabbos they got dried and they were edible, and in the middle of Shabbos the Bailam saw that it's yavesh and it's edible, mutter. You're allowed to eat them on Shabbos. Why? Because when he carried them up to the roof, he wasn't mocked to them. He didn't exclude them. He only wanted to wait till it would dry. And now it dried. It's muchan. Elalav, but as a matter of last possibilities, it must be a case in this price of the chazu. When they entered into Shabbos, they were edible. Idchu, the rains fell, and they were no longer edible. Then the sun came out and dried them. And he needs hazmana. He's got to have singled them out on Erev Shabbos and designated them for achila. If you're going to hold against Rava that there's no such thing as muktzah chatzi Shabbos, hazmana. Why is it necessary for him to designate them for achila purposes if now they're edible? They were edible entering into Shabbos. Ein muktzah chatzi Shabbos. Now they're edible again. Why do I need hazmana? Elamai. So the Gemara asks a question, an objection that's raised against this proof. Yesh muktzah. What do you want to tell me? That you must be holding the yesh muktzah chatzi Shabbos. So then, how are you explaining the halacha hazmana? Ki azmin lehu my havi. What good is hazmana when at some point it became unedible? It's muktzah and yesh muktzah l'Shabbos. So even according to Rava, we won't understand in the light of the sheet of yesh muktzah chatzi Shabbos how hazmana is going to be effective. Lo tzricha, the Gemara says, the Beitza needs to be mechadesh, that you need azman in the following scenario. The aksu v'lo aksu. The process of drying began before Shabbos, but it didn't reach its fruition. It was not yet completely dry. The ika inshi the achli. There are those who would eat it even though it's semi-dry. The ika inshi the lo achli. There are those who would not eat it. And in that case, we don't know whether it's muktzah or not. And what's going to determine whether it's muktzah? The owner of the fruits, Azmin, if he designates Mibojom before Shabbos that he will eat from it, Goli Daite, he has now revealed that he himself belongs to that group of people who would even eat it in this situation, and therefore it's not muktzah. Lo Azmin, lo Goli Daite. Omer Abzera Toshma, I will give you a final determination that ein muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos from the following brisa. Not a brisa, I'm sorry, from the following minhag. And it says that mipolin vadoshim, have various types of lentils and beans, and we eat them on Yom Tov. Wait a minute. The polin vadoshim make kara chazu lakos. At the beginning of Yom Tov, before they ripen, you can eat them raw. And now, in the middle of Yom Tov, you take them and shadina v'kedera, you add them to a pot for bishul. They get very, very hot. And idchule. You cannot eat boiling hot legumes. And here we turn to Chav Zayin. We'll finish up. Gomar bishulayu, chazulahu. As soon as he finishes bishul and the pot of food cools down a little bit, then you can eat it. We're not going to say that at one point it was so boiling hot, it was excluded, and yesh muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. No. Once it cools off, you're allowed to eat it. And that proves that ain't muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. According to your logic, Kederis the Alma. How are we allowed to eat any food that's cooked on Shabbos or on Yom Tov? You put the food into the pot on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov, and it's boiling hot. And at night, when it cools off, achlinu minayu, we're going to eat from that food. Why don't you tell me that it's muktzah because it was boiling hot entering into Shabbos? Ella, you're going to have to make the following distinction. Gemara bidei adam. If a person has to do something in order to improve the object so that it makes it in foodstuffs edible, lo kami boilon. We don't have such a suffix about whether it's muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos. For sure, a person would not be maktzah, he would not exclude something and call it dochui because he has within his power, within his hand, the ability to fix it up. And in the case of kederos, when you put food on the pot, all he has to do is wait until the pot cools off, and then he's going to eat it. So there's no muktzah on Beit Hashmashos. So therefore, in the case of pulin and adashim, those kind of lentils, you cannot prove anything about muktzah l'chatzi Shabbos because they weren't nidchu. But kikami boilon, our question was about gomro bidei shamayim, was the case of grogos v'tzimukim, and the rains fell down on Shabbos. That's out of his hands. That's something that depends upon nature. And therefore, it's Eino Nigmar Bidei Adam. It's only the sun that beats down when it comes out and dries up the food. And since it's Ein Biyado L'Saknom, therefore, he doesn't have das, and he's Mesiach das, and he thinks he's not going to be able to eat them. They're not edible. And on that, we have the suffix of Hillel, whether or not they become muktzah for the entire balance of Shabbos. So this is where we're going to stop for today. I wish you a Mo'adim L'Simcha, And tomorrow, Mr. Shem, here we'll do Daf Chav Zayin. I think tomorrow we'll start, if it's okay, at 9:30. If anyone has a problem with 9:30, please notify me. I know tomorrow's a very long davening. So you might say, Rabbi Berzon, there's no way we'll be ready at 9:30. So we can start at 10. But just notify me if you don't mind. Because if I don't get that communication, then I'm confused.
Okay.
And there'll be Hesek Hadas. I want to make that that designation already on the Erev Hoshana Rabbah, that we know on Hoshana Rabbah exactly when. Anybody want to just give me an idea of what their schedule is tomorrow, or it's too early to determine it? I daven Masikin, so we'll be finished by 8:39.
10 o'clock would be very good. 10 is good.
Let's call it for 10 o'clock.
I think 10 also, yeah.
Okay, so we'll call it for 10 o'clock. And if anybody has any objection, please let me know. WhatsApp is always the best way to get me. I look at Gmail as well. Chag Sameach, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Shkoyach.